Hey, everybody. If you are tuning into this stream after the fact, then you should probably fast forward about 8 minutes because, again, we started the stream early. The internet is listening to the sounds of you washing a dish while we wait to start.
Yep. So I probably should have closed this vent tab before I closed it. You have food you need to work tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
Put it in the container in the morning. You put it in a container in the morning?
Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't know if I needed to do it.
Hello. We're starting in about 3 minutes. What?
Your mom says she's waiting.
I waved. I waved back. Hmm?
I paused the video with you. I paused the video so it wouldn't play it with you going. Just to show you. I didn't do it on purpose.
I don't believe you.
It just happened that way.
Don't believe you.
Because I went to look to see if I need to turn that hall light on. But
Oh.
need more light or anything.
I mean, if we wanted to make more light, that one is probably the best one.
Better.
I don't know.
You're not watching.
I made the window super tiny so I wouldn't be distracted by my own face.
Oh, but you can still see the chat.
I could still see the chat, yeah.
See, I almost thought you would just slide it off.
Well, this is a compromise.
Okay.
For some reason, you still see the chat before I do, though. I don't really understand that.
Reminds me of the what is it? The So True Y'all or Southern people.
Mhm.
That one guy that was doing the what was it, trivia,
Mhm.
and people are like, "I was first. Mine popped up first. I'm not seeing people." So it's like comments pop up differently,
Mhm.
everybody, and he said, "Whoever pops up on mine first,
Yeah.
I can't help it."
Okay. So it's 7. Let's go ahead and get started with Exodus 1. Okay. And if you're following along on YouTube, feel free to make comments in the chat as we go through. If you're following on YouTube after the fact, sorry, I won't see your comments. Like, I can't go back in time, obviously. Why did I even say that? I do lots of dumb things.
It's because there's nobody here other than me.
I know, it's very, I like, anybody watching this is going to wonder why I keep staring over my screen at the only other person that I can talk to. Years from now, when there's no more, virus that shall not be named, people will not understand.
I don't know. We'll keep doing it.
Yeah. All right. So, Exodus chapter 1. Oh, hey, Amanda. Exodus chapter 1. Verse 1. These are the names of the son of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Each came with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Now, these are the guys who we actually met them in Genesis. If you read through Genesis, if you haven't read through Genesis, read through Genesis. Or I suppose you could watch any number of musicals and animated movies and get the general gist of the story of Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. But the interesting thing about this first 4 verses is the way it starts. These are the names of, etc. that's actually the same way that other passages in Genesis start. Specifically, Genesis 46, which talks about Jacob gathering up his whole family and coming to Egypt to meet Joseph, who he thought was dead.
Because this basically backs up, because at the end of Genesis, Joseph died.
Yeah.
So we're just kind of recapping, I guess.
We're short recap before we move on, right? Because obviously there's some space between the writing of Genesis and the writing of Exodus, right? But the writing of Exodus starts in a particular way to make you think about stuff in Genesis, as if to say, hey, we're continuing that story. And this is one of the ways that does it. We'll get into a couple more of them. So these are the names of course, the other sons of Jacob. Verse 5, the total number of Jacob's descendants was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. And of course, if you've read Genesis or watched Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, then you know that whole story. One thing to point out here is where it says, depends on your Bible. If you have perhaps an old King James, it says, and all of the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. So there's actually probably more than 70 people, right? The verbiage used there is just meant to signify specifically Jacob's offspring, not necessarily their wives and cousins and whoever else that would have come with them, right? Or other members of their households. So it's a big group. All right, 6. Then Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. So recap over. That's all Joseph gets. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Now, this is an interesting verse because you remember how we said that there was going to be language in this chapter that made you think of Genesis? Specifically, fruitful and multiplied. Where did you first see in the Bible fruitful and multiply?
Where it says be fruitful and multiply.
Where it says be fruitful and multiply, right? That's like God's original thing. Amanda asked about Buddy. They're back from the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it was pretty rough. Yeah. So yeah, the commission to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. That's what humankind was supposed to do, right? But then what did they do? They didn't. Specifically in the case of the Tower of Babel, right? Because remember, the whole Noah's Ark thing happened, and there's probably actually musicals about that one too. And then they all go into the ark. Rains happen, flood happens. They come out of the ark, and God goes, all right, be fruitful and multiply, right? And then they don't.
Yeah.
They make the Tower of Babel. They do something else. So the idea is that when you see those phrases, you're supposed to think back to Genesis and go, oh, they're finally doing what God wanted them to do, right? They're finally doing the right thing this time. We'll continue on in a little bit. Verse 8. A new king who had not known Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous, powerful than we. Let's deal shrewdly with them, otherwise they will multiply further, and if war breaks out, they may join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So
This is weird, because you would think if we treat them right, then they won't go away.
So there's some baggage in this, right? Which we'll go ahead and talk about that. But it's important to note here that there is a fuzzy amount of time between the passage of Joseph, right? The death of Joseph and his generation, and the arrival of this Pharaoh. The Bible just doesn't tell us at all how long that was. It's easy to assume that it was the next one in line, but that's not necessarily the case, right? Like it could have been quite some time between the death of Joseph and when these people decided that they weren't interested in the Israelites anymore. And you know what? We're going to go ahead and have to talk about it. We're going to have to talk at least a little bit about the chronology of the book. and dating the Exodus. Not dating in the sense of going out and getting pizza, but when did it happen? And there's basically two camps, because that's how these things always end up, right? There's the early daters and the late daters. You might have seen a movie on a documentary movie on Netflix called Patterns of Evidence. Perhaps some people in YouTube land might have seen a documentary on Facebook called Patterns of Evidence. That's by a guy who's arguing for the early date, right? The generally accepted date is the later date in the time of Ramses. And I think that's the 1200s BC. The earlier date is the 1400s BC, right? And basically, both sides have some pretty solid arguments. And in between these two periods, there was a group, or there was a time period called the Hyksos period, right? And this is just in addressing your question about why did they hate the Israelites. So in the Hyksos period, there were lots and lots of Semites, Canaanites, right? People from the Levant area that were really powerful in Egypt. And the native Egyptians absolutely hated them, right? So it seems like there was a kind of a cultural envy that they would have felt about overly powerful foreigners in their country, if that makes sense. So that's probably I don't know, I think the text seems to explain it here, that they would have been envious and suspicious of a powerful group of foreigners in their country. Now, since we mentioned chronology and we mentioned the Hyksos period, if you're a late dater, then you tend to think of the Hyksos period as when the Israelites must have been there. If you're an early dater, then the Hyksos period doesn't help you at all. And you have to argue some other way about how that whole thing works out, right? But anyway, we'll end the very short blurb on chronology by saying there's good arguments for both. And the Egyptian chronology is by no means an open and shut case. There's lots of people that argue lots of different things that have way more education than I do and still can't come to any particular specific agreement on how everything went. All right, moving on. So there's this new king. And he decides to make slaves of the Israelites. Verse 11. So the Egyptians assigns taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So the picture there is the Egyptians are trying to tamp down the Israelites. But the more they fight against them, the more the Israelites keep doing what they were supposed to do, which was to be fruitful and multiply, right? One more verse, and then we'll camp on this a little bit more. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this on them. Where have we seen brick and mortar before in the Bible, before Exodus? I gave you a hint earlier. The Tower of Babel, right? Specifically uses brick and mortar. Just like that whole story specifically starts with the verbiage, be fruitful and multiply, right? So in the story of Babel, the people were supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and they didn't. Instead, they chose to do something else. And what did it lead to? It led to judgment, right? In this story, the Israelites are doing the right thing, but Egypt imposes the whole bricks and mortar thing on them, right? Mm-hmm. So in the Babel story, you have what God wants people to do, and then you have this evil rebellion against it that results in the Babel incident. In the Exodus story, we're starting with what God wants people to do and this evil bricks and mortar thing that comes up. So the story is linking the Egyptians with Babel. It's linking the Egyptian Pharaoh standing against God later on in the story with the Israelites trying to obey God. It's casting them as the enemy, right? And it's specifically talking about this kind of stuff to make you think back to Babel. Okay. 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shurfa and the other one Pua, which is an unfortunate name in modern parlance, when you help the Hebrew women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. Now, this is a case of a wonky translation. Hi, Melissa. It's a wonky translation because, well, you heard what mine said, right? When you observe them give birth. That's not what the literal language actually says. What the literal language actually says is when you see the birth stool. Only it doesn't say birth stool. It says when you see the potter's wheel, right? It's, for some reason, translators went with birth stool, but in Egyptian literature, it's called a potter's wheel because there was an idiom in Egyptian writing that babies were being formed on the potter's wheel while they were, I brain farted in the middle of my sentence, while the mothers were pregnant. Does that make sense? So the idea was that the babies were being formed, the potter's wheel was spinning, and the babies were being made while mom is pregnant. Make sense? So when Pharaoh goes to tell the Egyptian midwives, when you see the stool, if it's a boy, kill it, and if it's a girl, let it live, the idea is probably that the midwives were supposed to try to determine whether a boy was going to be born and then kill the child before it was born, right? Because the next thing that Pharaoh tries is just kill them after the fact, right? So let's move on, another verse. The Hebrew midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this and let the boys live? So now they're in the hot seat, right? Why did you let the boys live? Well, if the midwives were supposed to wait for the boys to be born and then kill them, then the excuse they're about to give doesn't make any sense. So let's read their excuse. The midwife said to Pharaoh, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Okay. So if the idea was that they had to wait and see what the child was and then decide whether or not to kill it, well, what does it matter? They've already given birth. Just decide then, right? So if Pharaoh's instruction to them was to kill them after they had been born, then they would just be not doing what he said. Their excuse apparently gets them off the hook, which suggests that it's actually the other thing, that they're supposed to kill them before they were born. Does that make sense?
I guess.
Okay.
Like they had a system of knowing.
Yeah, and like I'm assuming that like most ancient medicine, it was pretty shoddy.
Yeah.
But there is writing that suggests that they had medical practices and had ways of trying to end pregnancies or determine what kind of child somebody was going to have.
I mean, we still have those old wives' tales.
We still have those old wives' tales today, exactly. Okay, verse 20. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied, and they became very numerous. So the more Pharaoh tries to squish them down, the more they do what God says, the bigger they get. Okay. 21. Since the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Pharaoh then commanded all his people, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live. So now he's had it, right? All right, he's going to abandon the whole kill them before they're born thing and just go with kill them after they're born, because then the midwives don't have an excuse, do they? Okay, we'll go ahead and do chapter 2. I don't think we're going to get into chapter 3. Chapter 2. Now a man from a family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. What does that sound like to you?
Hard.
What does that remind you of from the Bible? What story does it remind you of? Of somebody being kept safe in a thing made of plant material that was coated on the inside with pitch to keep it from leaking. Kind of sounds like the flood in the ark, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, continuing. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank. Seeing the basket among the reeds, she sent her slave girl to get it. When she opened it, she saw the child, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a woman from the Hebrews to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." So, can you see the irony here? Right? The whole idea of throwing them in the river was meant to kill the boys, right? But instead, we have this woman who's just trying to do what God told them to do. She's trying to be fruitful and multiply. She eventually ends up having to put the child in the river, but because things were arranged very carefully by God, not only does the child live, but she gets to at least partially raise the child and gets paid to do it. Meanwhile, all her other countrymen, fellow Israelites,
Jewish.
the other children of Israel, are being given forced labor. So you can see the irony, the turnabout, right? She's trying to be faithful, and instead of her son getting killed, her son ends up getting paid for by Pharaoh, who's trying to kill him. Make sense? All right, verse 11. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?" "Who made you a leader and a judge over us?" the man replied. "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Oops, he's done been found out. Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." Yes. When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water, filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away. But Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, "Why have you come back so quickly?" Can you see some foreshadowing in Moses rescuing some people and watering a flock of sheep? Seems like some foreshadowing there. I mean, we know the rest of the story, right? They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Verse 20. "So where is he?" He asked his daughters. "Why did you leave the man behind? Invite him home to eat some dinner." Like, you kind of get the idea he's trying to marry them off.
Yeah.
You found a dude who isn't a jerk and did all this work for you? Why'd you leave him there? All right, verse 21. Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son who he named Gershon, for he said, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." What does that remind you of? A foreigner in a foreign land. Abraham, perhaps? Because Abraham ended up settling in Canaan as a foreigner in a foreign land. So you can see there's tons of links to make you think back to Genesis. Well, what happened in Genesis? In Genesis, God established Abraham, a foreigner in a foreign land, and his offspring as God's people. And there was all kinds of drama and all kinds of things tried to stop that from happening. There were all sorts of problems, right? But eventually, Abraham has offspring. Those kids have offspring, and that's how you get to Jacob and his 12 sons, who then becomes named Israel, and the 12 sons go on, and that's how you get to here, right? So you're supposed to think about all that when we read this story. 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help ascended to God because of the difficult labor. So God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and he took notice. And that's where we're going to stop in the text for today. Does anybody have any questions out in YouTube land?
Does this 3 and 4 go together?
Yeah. 3 and 4 go together, and there's way more to talk about there than we can talk about in 15 or 20 minutes. Because that's the whole burning bush thing. Does anybody have any questions out in YouTube land? If not, this is a pretty short story, or a pretty short study.
You could just awkwardly wait.
I could just
Stare at them.
awkwardly wait and stare at them.
It might take a while to catch up.
I don't really feel like awkwardly staring at them.
Man says no.
Nope. Okay. Well, since everybody understands everything perfectly, if you come up with any questions, save them for next week. So uncomfortable. Yeah, it was uncomfortable for me. Yeah, save your questions for next week or post them in the Facebook group. We're going to get into the whole burning bush thing and the whole name of God thing. And there's some other stuff that we're going to talk about in relation to Midian and Sinai and all that kind of stuff for next week. But it doesn't really go with this stuff. The main thing that you should think about in this is a continuation of God's attempt to make a people. Very interesting after watching the Ten Commandments. Yeah, so what's I don't know who that is.
You were going to say something about the Ten Commandments. Just ignore that for now.
Yeah. Anyway. So there have been lots and lots of adaptations, right? And many of them, who is doing that?
Just ignore it.
Yeah. Many of the adaptations really attempt to fill in blanks and make statements about stuff that doesn't always follow. I'm just weirded out by whoever this person is. That's, yeah. Anyway, all I'll say is, yeah, we did get our first troll.
That's okay. They never stick around long.
They never do.
Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings.
So, all I'll say about that is think about the assumptions you might have about the story that come from the movies and plays and musicals and cartoons that you've seen about this story. And think about those assumptions and then think, maybe those things aren't actually in the text. For example, lots of people think that, the Bible says that the Israelites were forced to build monuments and pyramids. No, it never says that, right? It specifically says that they were put to labor on 2 cities. It's kind of it, right? Those are the only named things that they're given. Anyway, I am done for the night, and I will see you all later.